Welcome to this webinar on the challenges and trade-offs involved in sampling for surveys related to migration. My name is Jørgen. I'm a research professor of migration and transnationalism studies at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And we have 4 speakers that I'll introduce in a moment. The webinar is co-organized by the MIGNEX project that I lead and the Global Migration Data and Analysis Center of the International Organization for Migration in Berlin. And we will start after my brief introduction with 4 10-minute presentations by the speakers. Then I will moderate a discussion between or amongst the speakers on some core themes. And then in the last half hour of this webinar, we'll open up for questions from the audience. And we're very pleased that several hundred people have signed up and are watching us and have the opportunity to ask questions. You can do that via the form or the chat on the MIGNEX website. You can start asking questions there while the speakers are presenting, and we will keep compiling them and we'll address as many of them as we can towards the end of the webinar. So let me first introduce the 4 speakers before we move to the first one. We have Jasper Tjaden, who is Data and Impact Analysis Coordinator at the International Organization for Migration's Global Migration Data and Analysis Center, known as GMDAC, based in Berlin. He's leading GMDAC's work on experimental and quasi-experimental impact evaluations of IOM interventions. And we've been talking a lot with each other recently because we're doing similar work on the drivers of migration in West Africa based on surveys. Then we have Jessica Hagen-Zanker, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, in London, where she leads the Institute's migration research. She is also the survey lead for the MIGNEX project. You'll learn more on the project through Jessica's presentation. Then, still not with us, but in the process of connecting, we have Joseph Teye, who is the director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana, just on the outside of outskirts of Accra. He is also part of MIGNEX, and today he is not talking about that experience, but rather his role on another large multinational project on migration called MIGNEX. You'll learn more about that in the course of his presentation. And finally, we have Catia, who is the Associate Professor of Economics at the Nova School of Business and Economics in Lisbon. And she's also the Scientific Director of the Novafrica Research Center at the same university. She's done a lot of quasi-experimental work based on survey data on migration, both in West Africa or Africa more generally, and in Europe. And she will speak about her experiences with survey data collection among immigrants in Europe today. But we've partly come together, I think, as a team because of our shared interest in sampling migrants or potential migrants in the countries of origin. We've discussed a bit preparing for this, like how much technical expertise can we expect on the part of the audience, because survey sampling can get very technical, but it also involves a lot of equally important, less technical issues related to research design more broadly, and to research ethics, and to logistics and organization, and so on. And we'll try to avoid presuming too much technical expertise and to engage with some of those broader issues, which is also why we've chosen to frame it in terms of the trade-offs involved. So it's not really about saying this is the right way to do it, but these are the dilemmas that we have to face, and these are some of the ways in which we can approach those dilemmas or trade-offs. So with that, I pass the word to Jasper for the first presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jørgen, for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this. Thanks to the MIGNEX team, and everyone involved. I will share with you some recent experiences that we had at the IOM data center based out of Berlin with some of the recent surveys that we've done with potential migrants in particular and migrants in general. In my 10 minutes, I want to make 3 general points. They're motivated by recent experiences, and I'll provide practical examples, but I think they apply more generally, and you probably hear some of similar points made in the other contributions today. So the first point is, it's really important to think hard about which population I'm actually interested in. And that might sound very trivial, it might sound obvious, but in some cases, it's not that obvious, and it's worth thinking very hard about that. And I'll explain an example of that we faced in a recent project. The second one is available sampling frames often have problems. This is maybe a common point for many that many are aware of. I'll show you an example where this has become a problem for one of our recent projects and how we're addressing it. And lastly, unfortunately, migrants move, right? The very definition of a migrant involves some sort of movement from A to B. Well, that makes data collection quite difficult, because often migrants move between administrative regions. They change their contact details, switch phone numbers, change addresses, and so forth. So if you're interested in collecting information about migrants over time, having several touch points with them repeatedly, that becomes very tricky technically. And I'll allude to one example where we've grappled with that in one of our recent surveys. All right, so imagine a scenario. IOM is implementing a project targeting potential migrants in West Africa, right? IOM has more than 400 offices around the world, and many of them do collect data, contribute to research, sometimes collect data for operational purposes, and at times they also do research to find out how to improve their projects and to improve their evidence-based programming. So we had a project recently in West Africa, and we were interested to learn more about the impact about a particular project on potential migrants, so people considering to move. Now, our first intuition was, let's go for a probability sample for conventional or the best case approach to have a proper sampling strategy and use an existing sampling frame and so forth. But through discussion with other experts and sort of deeper deliberation about this, we were wondering whether it actually makes sense, because and the question then becomes, who are we actually interested in? Are we interested in potential migrants that are participating in our particular intervention? Or are we interested in potential migrants more generally as a random sample of a population in a particular region or district? And there are certain trade-offs associated with that, right? To just identify the effect of our project, we probably don't need a probability sample, right? Which incurs a lot of costs, a lot of time, and so forth. We could probably have a full enumeration of people participating in our projects and then follow up with them over time. As long, and that was our ambition, we follow an experimental approach. We have a treatment and a control group, and the randomization of who takes part in the project and who doesn't works. As long as that holds, there may be good reasons actually not to have a probability sample at all. There are certainly trade-offs when it comes to this question. Probability samples, of course, provide external validity, or sort of commonly referred to as representativeness. And on the other hand, often in some instances, they're just not feasible. So in our recent case in West Africa, we actually did go for a probability sample, or we are still in the process of going for it, because we wanted to have a general idea at the population level of who wants to migrate and who doesn't, and what are the factors that drive migration decisions, and what are the different impacts on relating to programs that IOM provides on that decision-making process. And that's why we sort of embraced a probability sample, and we're in preparation of a cluster randomized control trial. And just to run you very quickly through the steps here, we select a country, of course. We select districts. Both are based on context information on where migration is an issue or is discussed, is prevalent. Then we randomly pick from a list of so-called enumeration areas a number of enumeration areas to then include in our study. From that list, we then randomly pick enumeration areas where IOM is running projects, and randomly another list where they are not. And then in the end, we will compare the two, right? And then in each, at the enumeration area level, we will randomly pick households to interview in our study at baseline and then follow up with them at end line. Now, all of that sounds well and nice, and I will now go to my second point, which is if you go through with that approach, you will need a sampling frame, right? And the sampling frame you usually get through the national statistical offices. So you apply for it, you pay for it, and then at some day you get a map in the mail and then Excel files in your emails. And unfortunately, in some cases, or in many cases, particularly in low-income contexts and also in the West African context, the information you get that's included in the sampling frame is not leading up to expectations, let's say. Oftentimes, this information is outdated. Sometimes the information is inaccurate, and sometimes there is sort of less information than we would like to get, right? So for our case, we would need a list of households. Ideally, we want some information about households or average information about the enumeration areas like age, demographics, gender demographics, and so forth. In our particular case, and I included a screenshot of a map here, it was actually the case that the information that was provided to us, the map was not consistent with the Excel file. So in some cases, there were fewer households in the data provided than what could be identified in the map, and other times the other way around. This, of course, creates a lot of issues for sampling. And I think in Jessica's presentation, you'll hear more about ways around that difficulty and new and innovative ways to create your own sampling frame. Now, I want to mention one other point, which is linked to our recent survey work in West Africa as well. We are conducting our probability sample and drawing a sort of representative sample of households. We have potential migrants included as members in these households, and we are interested to monitor the situation over time. We're interested in a so-called panel survey or longitudinal surveys where we follow up with individuals included in our study over time to understand who is actually migrating and who is not. That's one of the goals of this survey. But of course, for data collection, this becomes inherently tricky. People that move often change their telephone numbers, so it's hard to get a hold of them through their phones. They often obviously change addresses. Some people may not use formal channels for migration and use informal channels, which there could be an interest not to be part of any data collection for fears of persecution or legal implications. And all of that makes things difficult for us. And that is also one of the reasons where we decided to sample households, because at least then the remaining household members could provide information about those individuals that might have left the household. The general issue with migrants moving is that the underlying population changes, and I think that will also be come up in Katia's talk, that if you do a survey about immigrants in a certain country, maybe to their monitoring their integration, the population then you want to make inferences about actually is constantly changing because there are newcomers coming in and people move on. So the people in your sample constantly changes, which creates issues. But the issue for us in the recent example was mostly attrition, which means people dropping out from our surveys because we can't reach them anymore. We did a test now, a pilot test, to run a phone and WhatsApp survey with samples of around 10,000 people that were included in previous projects that IOM has run, and where we kept their contact details and asked for their consent to be included in further studies. So we called them up 1 year later, and we were only able to reach up to now 10% of the phone numbers that were valid. And then there's also a share of telephone numbers that are not valid anymore. So it just shows you the difficulty of executing panel surveys with such a mobile and often hard to reach population. There are alternatives, and maybe we discuss some of them in the discussion. Just want to mention a few: location time-based sampling, capture-recapture techniques, respondent-driven sampling, and also some post-stratification techniques to overcome general issues with sampling hard-to-reach populations. Maybe it will be mentioned. Maybe we have room to discuss it later in the discussion. I have some resources for everyone that I will just post in the chat for everyone who's interested. And with that, I would close. Thanks a lot, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Jasper. And then we move on to Jessica.
Thank you, Jørgen. Sorry, looking for my full screen view. There we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to talk to you today about the MIGNEX project. MIGNEX is a 5-year EU-funded project on migration and development. And our overarching objective in MIGNEX is to contribute to more effective and coherent migration management through evidence-based understanding of the linkages between development and migration. And we do this by collecting quantitative, qualitative, and policy data in 25 research areas across 10 MIGNEX countries. And one of my roles in the project is leading on the MIGNEX survey. And in this short presentation today, I'll tell you a bit more about some of the challenges we encountered in designing the sampling strategy and how we address them. Oops. Okay. I'm going to first give you a brief introduction to the MIGNEX survey. The aim of the survey is to collect data on migration and development experiences and processes in the 25 research areas shown on the map here. These areas have been selected across 10 countries to understand how migration is linked to specific and often localized aspects of development, considering, for example, changes in access to services or employment opportunities. These areas are highly diverse in terms of socioeconomic context, specific developments, but also their size, ranging from 20,000 people to around 100,000. Our survey collects comparable data on a number of development areas and migration aspirations and experiences. Data collection has been delayed by the corona pandemic, but will actually resume early next week with Joseph Teye's team in Ghana. In each research area, we sample 500 respondents in the population of 18 to 39-year-olds. We focus on this particular group because their lives are most likely to have been touched by migration in one way or another. And within this group, we're interested in anyone. So that could be those with migration experiences, but also those without, as well as immigrants to those research areas. Our aim is for our sample to reflect the population of interest within the research area, so we are using probability-based sampling methods. We had the luxury of being able to spend almost a year on the design of the survey, which allowed us to weigh up the benefits and disadvantages of different approaches. And this also meant we could try different approaches and actually pilot the sampling strategy alongside the survey instrument in 3 countries earlier this year before making final decisions. And in my contribution today, I'd like to focus on 2 particular challenges we had. They're quite similar to Jasper's challenges, actually. The first we had was lack of population data to allocate interviews to clusters. And the second is lack of a sampling frame to sample respondents. Great. So we wanted to collect representative samples of our target populations in 25 research areas. And the best way to do that would be through simple random sampling, selecting individuals from an up-to-date sampling frame. And across the 10 countries, we had huge differences in terms of data availability. In many of them, we ended up with similar maps as Jasper showed in his presentation. And most of the countries do not have accurate or up-to-date inventories of their population. So we had two options here. One was to use whatever data we can get our hands on in each country, or to develop a common process that works for all countries. And as I alluded to just now, collecting comparable data is a priority for us in MIGNEX. And that meant we opted for working with the lowest common denominator, and we developed a clear, simple, and easily replicable process that can be applied across all contexts. So our first challenge was lack of population data to allocate interviews. Not having up-to-date population lists, not having those sampling frames in the different research areas means that we don't know the exact number of residents within the research area as a whole, but also not within smaller clusters in the research area. One option here is to first do a household listing, but this is costly and time-consuming, so we opted for another approach. We drew on GIS methods to develop a simple approach for estimating the population. First, we use satellite maps to identify smaller areas called clusters within each village or town or city. And later, a number of these are randomly selected proportional to their size. This helps us ensure that our sample isn't biased towards one part of the research area. We then estimated the number of households within each cluster by counting the number of buildings within it, as you can see on the slide here. In doing so, we make assumptions about how many households live within each building. For example, the size of a shadow can indicate whether it's a multi-household household, and we would then make assumptions about how many households live within the building. And these assumptions are then verified by people who are familiar with the area. This is then complemented with another verification exercise where we compare our virtual household estimates to the reality on the ground. If the margin of error between the desk-based estimate and the field-based count of households is greater than 20%, we will still proceed with a household listing prior to data collection, but this process allows us to cut out listings as much as possible. When we piloted the approach in Cape Verde during our survey pilot, the results were very promising, actually, although they also revealed some problematic assumptions we'd made. For example, we overestimated the number of households that live in multi-household dwellings. And as a result, we revised our sampling strategy to include an explicit step of verifying our assumptions with locals familiar with the area, as well as doing the on-the-ground verification exercise. The second challenge we had was around selecting respondents. As I mentioned before, the gold standard for selecting respondents is to randomly draw them from the sampling frame in advance of data collection. We can't do this, both because our sampling frames are too basic and also because we're interested in the population of 18 to 39-year-olds. Through our desk-based estimates, we only know the number of households per cluster, not individual household members, nor do we know where people live. So to overcome this, we use a random walk for sampling respondents. A random walk involves systematically walking through neighborhoods to sample households. The basic principle is to organize the random walks so that every household's likelihood of being sampled is as similar as possible. Random walks are often criticized for not drawing representative samples, although some new approaches have tried to address these issues by sending enumerators on planned random walks. We looked into this, but given the organically grown and unplanned nature of many of our research areas, it would have just not been feasible. Instead, we set out to do basic random walks, but to do them well and consistent. We set out clear and detailed and replicable guidelines and created training materials covering all aspects from starting points to navigating dead ends to ensure random walks were done consistently. They have to work for all field teams in across the 25 research areas and be straightforward to implement by fieldwork supervisors and enumerators. And some examples from our training materials are included here on the slide. In developing this process, we paid particular attention to ensure that certain areas within clusters, for example, more informal settlements, are not left out. This is really important for us because it allows us to capture all people in our population group of interest, regardless of their immigration or residential status or the type of dwelling they live in. And we do this by giving clear instructions on which dwellings to count and what constitutes a turnoff, and by carefully selecting starting points. And a final point on random walks, we also considered potential scenarios in random walks, and in advance came up with solutions to potential challenges. And I'll give you one specific example. On a random walk, enumerators count every X household, and this is called the sampling interval. Sampling intervals are calculated by considering the total number of households in the cluster, as well as the specific sample size required to ensure that the entire cluster is covered through the random walks. But for large sampling intervals, the walks between interviews can be really long, so we decided to cap them at 10 maximum. But if the originally calculated interval was higher, the random walks with a reduced sampling interval of 10 won't cover the entire cluster. And that means some areas in the cluster would be missed out, and this would bias our sample. The figure here on this slide illustrates the effect of artificially reducing the sampling interval. Panel A shows that at the original interval, we would cover the entire cluster. Panel B shows that with the capped interval, only part of the cluster is covered. And it also shows the effect of starting points and shows that it has a great impact on which parts of the cluster are covered. Therefore, we developed a process where starting points for capped interval clusters are not randomly selected, are actually randomly selected instead of selecting them manually. And this ensures that the sample within this cluster isn't biased in any systematic way. I'm going to finish here for now. Many thanks for joining us today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have in the Q&A. Back to you, Jørgen.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Joseph. I've already introduced you to the audience, Joseph, so now we are waiting for your presentation, which I look forward to.
Thank you, Jørgen. Thank you, Jørgen, for the introduction. I'm sure you can see my slides very well.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, so I am going to present on the challenges associated with sampling respondents in the MIGNEX survey in Ghana. And we, by way of introduction, we in Ghana have been involved in a number of surveys. So we have done surveys on immigrants at destination. Here, the destinations have been urban areas in Accra, and that was part of the MIGNEX study, which is also funded by the UK government, and the MIGNEX study, which is also funded by the UK government. And these are studies that are focusing on foreigners that are living in Ghana. Our major problem with those studies had to do with lack of a sampling frame. So in many cases, we have had to use snowball or respondent-driven mechanisms or methods to sample them. And then we have also conducted in the past survey of migrant households and non-migrant households at origin. One of these was the Migrating Out of Poverty, which was conducted in 2012 and 2015 and 2018. And we had challenges such as lack of a sampling frame because we don't have households listed in Ghana. And then, so we had to overcome those challenges, we have had to list households. One other problem with those studies is because they were focusing only on migrant households, we tend to oversample the migrant households. And so the common trade-offs for the two studies, those on immigrants and those on migrants at the origin, or migrants household at the origin, has to do with how do we ensure that we are able to apply a probability sampling technique that will give each and every person an equal chance of being selected. The issue of cost is also in some of those studies and whether they are feasible at all. The presentation for today will, however, not focus on those studies we have conducted before, but rather on the MIGNEX survey. And the MIGNEX survey is different from those other studies we have conducted in various ways. First of all, the MIGNEX survey, as you have heard, is focusing on the general population. And in Ghana, we are doing the study in 3 areas, which has been mentioned already. We are going to study 1,500 households. And because it's on the general population, we'll be able to get immigrant households, households that have current migrant, that is what we call immigrant households. We also have non-migrant households, so that is the advantage of that. Jessica has mentioned the other details of that already, so I'm not going to repeat that. So what are the challenges that we have with the MIGNEX sampling strategy in Ghana? Jessica has already explained the entire sampling. So as we implement this in Ghana, what are the challenges that we encountered? So first of all, the stages in Ghana were just as was explained. We have to identify house clusters, and then we have to sample households within the clusters. And then we have to sample respondents. The major challenge was lack of up-to-date sampling frame. So Ghana is using a sampling frame that was designed initially in 2010 during the population and housing survey. And so this sampling frame still has household information that are based on the 2010 census. Fortunately for us, the enumeration maps were designed recently, that is 2019, to help do the 2020 census, which we are here to do. So one major problem is the lack of up-to-date sampling frame. What it also means is that apart from the fact that we don't have the current population and the current household numbers, the sampling frame in Ghana also does not show households on the ground. So all sampling frames in Ghana, they just show the enumeration areas and the houses, but the households that are living in these houses are not known. And so it is difficult for us to know these households on the ground. And then also some of the housing structures do not have numbers. So in the developed countries, you see that all housing structures will have some form of addresses. Here, many of them do not have. And then also there was a challenge of how do we get comparative data, because Ghana will be compared with other countries. And our years in Ghana, the way they are defined is slightly different from natural years or enumeration areas in other countries. So that was a challenge. Then there was also a problem with the random walks, which we need to follow in order to select households and respondents. And in Ghana, we have dispersed settlements in rural areas such as Madi, and this is difficult to implement. Also, we have slums, a lot of slums in Ghana. And so some of the places, there are no roads. And so if the random walk is supposed to follow particular routes, this is a problem. So what strategies did we develop to deal with these challenges? First of all, we tried to do a complete listing of households in Ghana. This has a problem because it has cost implications, and then also the feasibility listing all households. But we thought that we have enough resources to do that. And so we are going ahead with a complete household listing. During the household listing, we try to provide numbers to all the houses that appear. So those with that addressing, we also have some temporal numbers, MIGNEX numbers that are provided. We have also engaged in extensive training and practicing of random walks. We are doing that even today. which is one of the activities we are undertaking now to ensure that the problems with the random walk are well done. Then other problems that we encountered have to do with selection of respondents. And as you heard already, the main study is about to start in Ghana, but then we have done the pilot survey already in 2 enumeration areas. So some of the challenges that I'm talking about now have to do with both the pilot and also what we have seen from other studies. So how do we implement the probability sampling here? Here, the random walk is based on the probability sampling. We have a probability sampling to follow to select respondents, which is very robust, but it's slightly complicated for enumerators. That means we need to do a lot of training. I've talked about the cost and the time components already as challenges. Then household members, when you visit some of the households, that came out during the pilot study, and we experienced it a lot, and we are thinking it will come up again. You visit some of the households and everybody is insisting that they want to also be interviewed. And this is because in many settings, many other researchers, we tend to interview the household head. And so it is not common for people to be at home and then you select 18 to 39-year-olds to interview. So during the pilot, there were situations where the household head wanted to be interviewed. We are thinking we anticipate more of those problems. And therefore, that is something we need to deal with. We have had to spend time to explain to them our sampling procedure, which is why we are not able to interview everybody. And then some of the sample respondents are also reluctant to take part in the survey. Sometimes, especially because it's an election year, people sometimes will think it is linked to election. We had those situations during the pilot. We are anticipating there will be more of that. And so we think we have to spend a lot of time explaining to them about the research and also not forcing people to participate in the way. And then sometimes the sample respondent is not at home. And that means we need to go back several times of the day, especially in the family community. Some of them, we might only meet them during the evening. And that is something. The gender norms in Ghana are also a problem. So for instance, you want to interview women in some of the houses, and that is difficult to send a male enumerator to do that. So we are planning to ensure that females, as much as possible, interview females and males interview males. Then COVID-19 related issues are already a problem, so they have been built into our training. Then also we have gotten a lot of material, logistics and things we have purchased already to ensure that people stay safe as they do the interview. Then there are other ethical issues that came up during our design. A lot of the MIGNEX ethical issues have been followed, but those that are important to the sampling is that of informed consent to ensure we are not forcing people, and then also to minimize the victimization of respondents. So we have to explain to other people, and then we have to make sure that people don't stay close to the respondent to listen to the respondent. In conclusion, we can say that there were a lot of challenges that were faced, or a lot of challenges will even be faced in the main study. But within the MIGNEX handbook provides useful guidelines for dealing with some of these. There are a lot of trade-offs that we have to make and decisions. That is probability versus non-probability sampling, for instance. We are going for a probability sampling and random walks, but that will require a lot of time. We've already talked about the challenges we have in relation to cost of doing this. But I think we are better placed to do that one. We think to do this one, effective collaboration with our partners is very important. Our collaboration with PREAO and ODI has been very effective, and we have used that one to manage some of the anticipated challenges. Also, we are collaborating effectively with the Ghana Statistical Service. The enumeration maps and some of the issues and the information that we needed have been provided by the Ghana Statistical Service, and that is helping us a lot. We think even though we have done all these things and we are using experienced enumerators, we need effective monitoring of supervisors and enumerators on the field in order to ensure that the guidelines are effectively implemented. We hope if we are able to do all these things, we will get very high quality data. I want to thank you here for listening to me, and then I will end here, hoping to take questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Then we proceed with Katia's presentation.
Thank you, Jørgen, and well, thank you everyone for listening. And I should say that listening to all of these presentations really rang many bells, as we have been doing a lot of work with migrants and families of migrants in Africa for the past 15 years or so. So today I would like to tell you a bit about our experience sampling mostly African immigrants in Europe. And I'll tell you about these two experimental projects that we did. One was, well, 10 years ago in Ireland, and the other one, which is ongoing currently here in Portugal. So they are both experimental in the sense that we are trying to measure the impact of interventions, okay? So policies that we are implementing with immigrants in this case. And so in this project in Dublin, what we did was we were trying to have immigrants contact more often and for more time their families back home. We were trying to measure what was the impact of this increased information flows, this increased information on things such as financial remittances or new migrants arriving, more return migration. So this was the kind of experiment. And so for this purpose, what we did was we interviewed 1,500 recently arrived immigrants in Ireland. Okay? And by recently arrived, I mean they had arrived in the previous 10 years. And what we got was a representative sample that included about 100 nationalities, or 100 countries of origin, to be more precise, where 19% of these were from Nigeria. So I'll detail this, but let me just introduce the two experiments. So this was one project. Now, the other one that we are currently doing here in Lisbon, Portugal, is also an experiment where what we are doing is we are conducting this experiment where we are trying to improve immigrant integration. And for this purpose, we are providing modules of information and also on aspirations, okay? Trying to raise people's aspirations for themselves. And so for this purpose, we have now collected 2,000, the contacts for 2,000 recently arrived immigrants here just from Cape Verde, okay? So let me say that recently arrived here means 5 years, okay? And 5 years because after you live in Portugal for 5 years, you are at least legally eligible to get a residence permit. So we are trying to work with immigrants that might not be as integrated as those that have arrived a longer time ago. And we are focusing on Cape Verde because the purpose of this project is not only to improve immigrant integration, but also to measure the impact on the families of these migrants back in Cape Verde. So we are doing work both in Portugal and in Cape Verde. But here, for today's explanation, I'll just focus on the work that we have been doing here in Portugal. Okay, so these are the two experiments, and we proceeded very differently in terms of sampling for each of these projects. So the first one, okay, that already took place a long time ago. It's now published, and this is joint work with Guy and Narciso. Well, what we did was we decided that we wanted to have a representative sample, okay, because we thought we really want to have the results of our experiments being externally valid for all the immigrants that are here in Dublin. Okay, and so these actually entailed a lot of work. Okay, and I'll share and I'll have this discussion on the trade-offs that this entails. So what we did was we took the latest sample, the latest census. It was the 2006 census, and we took it as a sampling framework. Then we selected 100 enumeration areas, that is, well, roughly speaking, neighborhoods within Dublin, the greater Dublin area, and they were selected using this probability proportional to size sampling, meaning that areas with more migrants, I want to skip the technicalities, but it just meant that the number of migrants that we had in our sample was representative of the overall population of immigrants in the greater Dublin area. What we did was, so we had these 100 areas where we were going to work, and we pre-selected random starting addresses. Okay, so the same that Jessica was just describing. Okay, and so what we did then was we had a random route with a very precise protocol for what enumerators had to do. Okay, so we had intervals of 5 between 5 households or dwellings, depending on the type of street or housing that we were facing. Okay, now what was the result of this sampling strategy? Well, it meant that on average we had to approach 100 households before we could get one complete interview. Okay, so it was very, very extreme, we thought. I mean, this is very costly, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of time, and also in terms of enumerator motivation. We had to, enumerators, just take it that if on average you have to approach 100 households to get an interview, well, some people had to approach more. Okay, and so these enumerators were often demotivated, so we had to retrain several members of staff. Okay, so overall here the trade-off is really one about representativeness. Okay, so how well do you want to describe the whole population of interest versus the cost, okay, which, as you can see in this specific example, is really hard. One thing that I don't have in my slides, but that Jasper was mentioning, and I think that's very important, is this idea of attrition. So we tried to re-interview all of these 1,500 migrants 1 year after, and we could only find 10% of them. So it was really extreme. I mean, the reason why we could have some results for our experiment, and something that I advise you in case you are doing this, is we had repeated data collection. So in the first 6 months after we did this baseline interview, this first interview, we were conducting a phone survey, okay, every month. Okay, and that's really where we got our data from to get any results. So just, that side note. And then on to the work that we are currently doing. Okay, and so this is ongoing work where we are trying then to look at this integration of immigrants as a tool for development in general. And so we are working with both migrants in Portugal and their families in Cape Verde. And here it was really challenging for us to think about how to find the migrants. Okay, well, first, because we had this experience before that told us that, well, representative sample is too costly and maybe not worth the benefits. Okay? And I'll discuss this in a moment. But here, we had the challenges. So one of them was the most recent census. It's almost 10 years old. So, I mean, many things have happened in Portugal over this time period. So not really the kind of sampling framework we wanted to have. Then we were looking for other migrant surveys, but they don't really exist, at least detailed enough so that we would have information on our population of interest, which are the Cape Verdean immigrants. Okay, so we tried thinking of something else. We approached the many Cape Verdean immigrant associations in the Greater Lisbon area, but I mean, individual data protection laws did not allow them to pass the contacts or for us to get in touch directly with these associates. So we were really scratching our heads thinking of how do we find migrants. So what we came up with was, this solution. And I should underline, similar now to what Joseph had mentioned at the end of his talk, that, these are pandemic times in which we are conducting this survey, which is challenging. So we want to, we believe that the intervention we are implementing will be helpful for immigrants, particularly in these challenging times. These are vulnerable populations. These are being subject to the greatest challenges. At the same time, of course, we want to protect both these immigrants and our staff from contracting COVID. So what we have in place, obviously, are all of those recommendations from the health authorities, but also we don't want to enter too much people's homes. So what we were trying to do was, first of all, we identified clusters, okay, areas in which we have a higher density of immigrants, Cape Verdean immigrants in this case, residing, okay, and so what we decided to do was try to conduct a census of these immigrants outside, okay, in these migrant dense neighborhoods, okay. And I should say that, Portugal is not as nice and warm as Cape Verde, but people still like to hang out outside. And so what we have been doing, our team of enumerators, was, go to these areas outside these neighborhoods that are very, that have the highest density of Cape Verdeans residing, and we are conducting a census, okay? So the first step here was to do this, and obviously we took different times of the day, different days of the week, so as to, collect enough contacts. And then the second step, which is currently ongoing, is we are scheduling interviews with these migrants whose contacts we have collected, so that, at their leisure, at their convenience, we can spend 1 or 2 hours talking to them. Okay, so here clearly we had a very strong trade-off between representativeness versus feasibility. Okay, we wanted to make this happen. We think it's important. We are doing this intervention that we think might benefit this population, but well, we clearly did not even aim at having a sample that is representative of all the Cape Verdean immigrants in the Greater Lisbon area. And to conclude, I should say that I think, when we are thinking about how to sample, we really have to bear in mind what's the purpose of the survey. So one thing is, if you are interested in collecting information about your overall migrant population, if you have this, then for sure you may need a representative sample, and you have to do all that you need, maybe knock on 200 doors so that you get your one complete interview. But then, if you are doing this, what we were doing in this both these studies, what you are doing is experimental policy evaluation. If you are looking at a specific intervention that you want to measure the impact of, well, then perhaps you can trade off some of that representativeness for feasibility. Okay, just trying to find the people that can benefit from your intervention, and then ensure that the intervention or the treated groups and the control groups are randomly selected. Okay, and so, really to conclude, the constraints I think that we have to bear in mind is, well, first of all, field knowledge. Okay, and I think this is very important, both when you are sampling your African migrants in Europe and when you are working in Africa. Having the local knowledge of exactly how people live, what are their habits, how can you find them, is crucial. Okay, as all of you before me described, these migrants are a mobile population. We have to find them, and if we don't know where we are working, you won't be able to do it. And then, of course, it's time. Okay, some of these interventions are more time sensitive than others. In our case, so we started by just wanting to promote integration. We are also doing some work related to COVID. So time is of the essence. A representative survey takes, on average, much longer than one that is not fully representative. Of course, there is a trade-off here also between time and money, because if you have more money, probably you'll be able to do it faster. But still, the more representative it is, the more expensive the survey will be. And finally, human resources. Having properly trained and motivated human resources is often a very important constraint that will also impact the quality of the data that we get. And so, well, these were my starting points. So I'll just thank you and give the word now to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catia. Thank you to all of you for your presentations. So now I'll start off with one question, but then we'll move fairly quickly to the open discussion. But I wanted to ask you about a trade-off that I think has been sort of running through many of the presentations, which is the one between sample size and sampling quality. Because we know that when results are presented and when studies are published, it matters a great deal if you have 500 or 2,000 respondents in your survey. But maybe if you go about sampling as conscientiously and systematically as one would ideally want to do, you can only afford to have 500 within a fixed budget. So then there is really a trade-off between either being very conscientious about the sampling methodology and accepting a lower sample size, or cutting corners in order to increase the sample. And I think since the sample size is so visible, it's such a striking aspect of the results and so important for how it's received, while things like knocking on 99 doors before you finally get a yes, that's a kind of a quality stamp for the sampling process, but it's largely invisible compared to something like the sample size. And I think the same goes for a lot of the other strategies that we discussed, that a lot of the investment that we put into to really improving the quality of sampling and reducing the bias is relatively invisible in the final product compared to other aspects. So what are your thoughts about that trade-off and the sort of temptation to go towards increasing the sample size? Could just raise your hand to go first?
Well, I don't know if you follow the order. You can just start talking. I mean, my answer is kind of easy, okay, in the sense that, so what I do typically are these experimental studies where we have an intervention to improve development and we want to measure the impact of. And so for these, we typically conduct these statistical power calculations. There is a minimum size of the sample that we need to have in order to conduct these studies. If we have the budget to do it, we do it, otherwise we don't. I mean, there's no point in doing experimental evaluations if the sample size is too low, because you will not have results. So that is really where I think I draw the line. And obviously, I mean, we always have to have, so the trade-off here, I think, or the margin where we can adjust is, for example, what I was just describing. I mean, I could just meet people in the street and try to do the surveying right away. I think the quality of those data would be weak because people were just not prepared, not available. There would be selection in the people that would respond. So what we decided to do is to spend more resources revisiting them at the time of their convenience so that we can have proper quality data. But oftentimes I think it's a decision of going ahead with this project or not, depending on the budgets.
Jessica?
So in MIGNEX, we took a different approach because it wasn't an experimental survey. We, in advance, years before we actually did the research, decided on 500 respondents per research area, which can sound quite low. But of course, when you put all of the countries together, it sounds more impressive. But because we're looking at so many different outcome areas and such different areas, there was just no way of being able to do power calculations in advance. So we just decided, well, let's go with a number that is feasible in all areas, and we stuck to that. I do think so. There is that trade-off, and if we're just talking about one research area, 500 obviously sounds low. But I think focusing on that one number is also quite short-sighted in a way, because if we do take shortcuts in the data collection and we don't do revisits and some of the other approaches we discussed today, we end up with a sample that's quite biased in different ways. And we end up with a sample where the analysis just doesn't really work, where we can't find any significant findings, for example. So I think you do pay the price pretty soon if you take shortcuts. And I also think there is now more understanding and openness to hearing these more technical aspects. I was really pleasantly surprised to see how much interest there was in this webinar today, actually. And I think the small sample size can definitely be explained very well by giving a short description of a good sampling process.
Right, just to add to that, I'm totally with Catia and Jessica on this. I think most people are fixated on the sample size because it's easy to understand and it sounds impressive if you have a lot of people in your sample, right? Rather than if you have fewer people, they think, how reliable it is. But I think the sample size alone doesn't tell the whole story about data quality, right? You could have a really large sample, but very low quality data if your sampling is bad or your execution is bad. On the other hand, you could have smaller samples, but that are very powerful. for example, based on some of these power calculations that Catia and others are using, that we're also using for experimental surveys and other surveys, in some cases, you don't need that many people to arrive at the result that you want to see, or not the result, but to do the type of analysis that you want to do. It also depends on what you expect, what type of analysis you want to do, and what your research question is. So, I think the more is always better, and it doesn't apply here. And I wanted to make one other point, which sort of came up in Josef's presentation, and also in some of the others, is even if you have a perfect sampling frame and you have all the money you want and you go for the best, for the ideal case, right, there could still be issues with representativeness, for example, due to unit or item non-response. So basically people not responding to certain questions, or people dropping out of the sample, not wanting to participate for whatever reasons, or not being able to reach them at all, right? So even if you have the fantastic sampling frame, there could be many issues around that, which adjusting for those issues is not that straightforward. So there could even be surveys with good sampling frames that are still limited in some aspects. So, I mean, this is all a fairly depressing story that we're putting out here, but I think it's a story of you gotta do what you can and make it transparent. I think that's the biggest message, making each step transparent to the reader of what went into the sampling, what kind of thinking went into it, and then laying open the data and all the biases that it has. I think that's the most important thing to do here. Okay, over.
Joseph, do you have? Please
so my colleagues
great.
have said many of the things I wanted to say, but what I just want to emphasize here is, as Catia said, once you get the minimum sample size that is required to be able to make very good conclusions, you shouldn't be fixated so much about increasing the sample size just because you want to say you have interviewed more people. The quality too matters. But in some circumstances, it is just not possible for some researchers to say that you are following even the probabilistic sampling and other robust mechanisms that we outline. For instance, if you are dealing with hard to find immigrants in some, for instance, you may have to go with convenience sampling, but then there are also mechanisms for ensuring that even if you are using convenience sampling, it means that you are able to enhance the quality of the data that is collected. For instance, you are forced to use something like Snowball, then you may have to come in with different nodes, or if you are using respondent-driven sampling strategies, there are approaches that you can adopt. It will not be as perfect as a probability sampling, but then you are enhancing the quality. So we need to invest time and money into those other ways of improving upon the quality of the sampling strategy, even when it is not possible to have a probability sampling. That is just something I want to add here.
Okay, thanks. Then I think we should shift towards engaging with questions from the audience, and we've received many so far, so I'll have to be a bit selective, but there are several that follow up nicely from this topic. One from GMDAC at the Mixed Migration Center, asking about how to go about sampling under high resource constraints. Because, I mean, Catia, you mentioned how you basically say that if you don't have resources to do it well, then you don't do it, which is in a sense a luxury. That maybe, you know, if you're in the field in a situation where there's limited funding and limited time, and you just have to do a survey in the best possible way, with limited resources. What are then some best practices to follow? What can we offer in terms of advice for a sort of quick and dirty approach to sampling, which is as good as possible to create or to produce data when it's needed with the resources that are available? Who wants to? Yeah, Jasper, you can start, and then Joseph.
Oh, okay. Yeah, quick response to that. I mean, for IOM, we're actually often in situations where there's no sampling frame and there are limited resources, but the situation is then unfolding very quickly and you need to address this. I mean, IOM works a lot in emergency contexts, for example, where it's forced displacement across borders. These are situations that are unfolding very quickly, and IOM is providing humanitarian assistance and addressing, helping migrants in displacement situations. So of course you can't sit down half a year, think about your research design and consider sampling frames and then go out. You have to go there next month. And of course there a probability sample is impossible, but there's still other ways to improve data quality, right? You can sample from a flow and work towards a probability sample. You can do location-based sampling, and there's discussion in the literature on whether these are capable of arriving at a true probability sample. But at least there's more thought that goes into how representative this data is or not. And but I think if you do have time and there's no emergency ongoing, I think there are situations where the best advice would be not to do a survey, right? There are other research methods that can be used, qualitative approaches, interviews, expert interviews, focus groups. It really is about the question that you want to answer, and there are different methods to do different things. And I think the survey is not always the best way, even though sort of policymakers often believe in them because they have a number, right? And they like numbers. But sometimes the number doesn't mean much when the methods used to arrive at that number are not good. And then I would trust qualitative data more to answer different types of questions. So, thank you.
Those are really good points, Joseph.
Yeah. So in addition to ensuring that maybe you control your sample size, maybe you try to use the minimum sample size that can be used. In the sampling strategy also, there are different levels of probability sampling, even if you decide to use it. For instance, using the MIGNEX as an example, we have the resources, so we are going to do a listing. And after the listing, we have a very robust sampling strategy of selecting even the respondent at home, which means we have to get all the households and we have to know them. If we don't have money, there's a way of doing this, which we have done in other researches before, which is you go to the enumeration area and you use a systematic approach. So maybe you just go to every fifth house, and once you enter the households over there, you have to then do a kind of balloting to select just one household per house. It's not as perfect as what MIGNEX is using in terms of quality, but it's also not too bad because there is some level of probability there. Yes, that here is the housing structures that are being sampled as a result of the probability. And then when you go to a house and there is only one household head or one household person, you interview that person. If there are 2 or 3, it means the 3 we have to ballot. It doesn't give all of them the same equal chance, but it's something that can be done if you don't have a lot of resources. And you can publish such studies in high impact journals because it's also based on a robust methodology, though it's not as robust as what we are doing in MIGNEX. So I think it is up to the person designing the research to look at the resources and to design what the resources can do and then implement it effectively. That is what I would say for now.
Jessica, you raised your hand.
I don't know if I can.
I'll just add 2 really quick points. So one builds on Joseph, and I also wanted to say I would go about relaxing some of the criteria at different stages of the sampling process. So for example, within household sampling, maybe not insist on particular demographics or particular type of members or randomly selected household member, but to speak to whoever answers the door. That would make things a lot easier and quicker. But in all of that, when relaxing criteria and maybe taking some shortcuts, I would be sure to document it so that you know what your trade-offs are and so that you can justify your sampling method afterwards. The other point I wanted to make was around training of enumerators. So I think it's worth spending a bit more energy on that and potentially a bit more time before going to the field, really practicing the sampling process with enumerators to make sure they understand how it works. Because again, it saves time down the line, and also it just makes sure that your that the sampling process has worked, and that whichever method you do use is implemented well.
Yes. May I, Jørgen? Yes. Okay. There are excellent points. What Jessica is saying. Okay. So documenting whatever protocol you're following and training, because if enumerators are trained, even if the field work is hard, things will go better. So I think this is really important. And generally speaking, agreeing with what with everyone just said, I think, well, again, we go back to the same trade-off between these representativeness and feasibility. So if we don't have enough money, I think it's fair enough to just try to make what is feasible. I would insist on getting local knowledge, because local knowledge is what helps us knowing what biases may arise in this data collection. And in this way, we can try and avoid them. So there was here a question, I don't know how it will go, but I mean, for example, doing this work in COVID times, obviously, I mean, there are biases if you are doing work outside, but we try to minimize this by getting local knowledge on, I mean, when are people available, when are they outside, try different times of the day, different days of the week. So these are things that do not increase your cost, your surveying costs by a lot, and they minimize biases that could otherwise occur in the selection of the respondents that you include in your sample. So just these short notes.
Yeah, so we had another question on the issue of sampling through households and people not being at home, which is obviously a well-known problem to anyone doing surveys. So how have you gone about that challenge? And just a clarification point there, Catia, what you described from your sampling in Lisbon, then you essentially didn't rely on households because you contacted people outside, yes, right? And so then absolutely. So then go ahead, explain what you did.
Sorry. Okay, so yes, what we are targeting in all of these, I mean, all of this work that we did with immigrants in Europe was targeting individuals, not households. Typically, we have targeted households when we are trying to get information on the families of migrants at the origin. So most of the work I've done in Africa, so in Cape Verde or in the Gambia or in Mozambique, there we were in the Gambia, not necessarily. We were targeting households because we wanted to know what kind of remittances, being them financial or immaterial remittances, these families were getting back. And for that, I think it's appropriate to survey at the household level. But when you are interested in the decisions of potential migrants or of migrants already, then I think it is best to target individuals. So I think I'm answering all questions.
Yeah, because in MIGNEX, of course, we also are interested primarily in the individuals, but we try to reach them via households. For good reasons, but then also facing these challenges. So Joseph, do you want to elaborate on how we've tackled that?
Yeah, so in the case of our pilot study in Greater Accra, for instance, in the two enumeration areas, we face a lot of that, and we are anticipating more of that even as we go to the rural areas. So what we learned from this is that you go to a house where the person is not there. The best thing to do is to ensure that we have said they have to call back at 3. They're just not calling back at 3 times. That is why mistake people do. So he goes there at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. They are not there. The next day he goes there at the same 2 p.m. He may not find them. So if you have found somebody in their house, what works for us is finding out about when the particular person selected is likely to be who. If the person works in an office, we realize in the MIGNEX that it works for us effectively during the weekend. So Sunday and Saturdays work for many of the office workers, or evening after maybe 5 work for some. This is an odd hour that we were able to train our enumerators in such a way that maybe instead of doing data checks and other things in the evening, they do it in the morning. So they are able to get to certain people that are hard to find during the evening. We are anticipating that the same thing will be the situation in family communities. Now, in extreme cases, it is possible to get a phone number of the selected person from other siblings in the house. And that is very good, because then you can be special appointment with the people, especially when you are sampling just about 20 people in the whole enumeration area. That has worked for some time. Because if that is not followed and you don't train them very well, they just tend to go back to the house the same time for 3 times, and then they just click that they are not able to find them, and then they change it. And then so you end up having many people who are not working in offices or who are not working in farm. Even though you have designed your setting very well to ensure that you get both workers and non-workers, if you don't train them well and you tell them the times they have to do the callback, they will end up just going back 3 times and click, they haven't found the person and they change. And so you end up getting what you didn't want to get. So I think in the training, you need to emphasize some of these, which is what we are doing in the MIGNEX training. Thank you.
Which is also why we spend a full week training enumerators for MIGNEX in each country, which emphasizes the point that Catia also made earlier about the importance of training. And I think most of our enumerators have experience from before, so we're not training them from scratch, but still, it's just really, really important to get them to understand also why following these tedious procedures is important. Why, when David is not at home but Peter is at home, why can't you just interview Peter instead? Of course, just telling them to follow the protocol without really taking the time to explain why it's important also makes a difference for motivation. Jasper?
Yeah, very quick point. I think going back several times is definitely a good idea, as many times as you can. But then if the household ends up dropping out, there should be sort of a sampling with replacements, right? There should be other households or people that then are drawn into the sample to replace the previous one. So if you have the luxury of having a sampling frame, or even, doing random walks, you can also do that fairly easily, right? If you try 5 times at a certain household, you replace it with the next one on your random walk. So I just want to mention that brief point.
Jessica, do you have something to add on this?
Well, no, I was hearing. Sorry, you said Jessica. Sorry.
Yeah, I think Catia was before me, but I think Joseph summarized it perfectly. I would just add that also just practicing and going out and doing the random walk and really understanding and over during the process of selecting respondents within a household, for example, is also really important, in addition to explaining why we're doing that.
Go ahead, Catia.
No, I thought you were calling me before. Sorry, trouble hearing. No.
Okay, then I'd like to raise another issue, which we've touched upon, which we've been asked about, which is the issue of working systematically across contexts that are very very different. So this is a question from Emmanuel Corsi at IOM Southern Africa Regional Office. So when we work, especially then in one project involving very different contexts, whether it's across countries or even within the same country, how can we then manage this trade-off between being consistent and adapting to the local context in each place? Okay, Catia, why don't you start this time?
Okay, so I always say the same thing, so it's not really original, but I would always go back to local knowledge. I think, of course, this is really hard, and I really think MIGNEX is doing wonderful work. I really enjoyed Jessica's presentation and learning about the work you are doing, because I think this is really challenging. And I think, Jasper knows much more about this as well, because he also has been doing work at countries to get comparable data. So I think this is really challenging. but I always go back to the same, which is the local knowledge. Okay, so when we really understand the population that we are trying to survey, we'll be able to come up with better strategies that in the end might be comparable across countries. I mean, this is very generic, but I think this is really the approach that when you have these two populations in different countries in different contexts, I mean, you always have to learn a lot about local knowledge before you go back and see, okay, what is the common approach that I can take to get these two surveys in a comparable way? And yeah, I'm afraid this is not really a perfect answer, but it is just what needs to be done for each specific case.
Jessica?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The approach we took in MIGNEX is to basically develop quite a basic process. So we called it meeting the lowest common denominator, and we developed a process that we knew was going to work in all research areas. So it's a process that's involves a lot of steps, but is still fairly simple to apply. It doesn't require a lot in terms of data. It doesn't require a lot in terms of softwares to use or GIS knowledge. It's just basically, it can be done with someone who has Excel on their computer and a satellite map, and that's it. And then we try to explain it in a very easy and easy way for people to understand, so that it can be replicated across the different research areas.
Joseph?
Sorry, me or Joseph?
Joseph.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I think they've said some of the things I wanted to say, but I want to add here something that is very important, which we did in MIGNEX very well, is bringing the researchers together to discuss some of these issues. I remember when we had to meet in the Netherlands, then we realized that there were several things that are different in different countries, but they are also similar. So for instance, Jessica is talking about differences in even what we are calling primary sampling unit or clusters or enumerators. Different statistical services may have different names. In some countries, they are larger than others. But through those discussions, we came out to say, okay, if it is bigger than, say, 200, it can be put into two groups. And that was very important. So it was an innovative way of dealing with the differences. In some countries where the enumeration areas were just 250 households and others are about 600 or 800, we were able to see that if they are so large, they have to be divided into two. This one depends on local knowledge, as Catia have said. Now, the challenge I've seen in some designs is it is possible that in one particular country something can be done, but maybe your research partner doesn't know, and he's not a survey person. And so he can say things that may not be implemented in other countries. So instead of dealing with only the country researchers, when it is becoming difficult, you need to get other experts in those countries. They may be available in the institutions, but they are not your research partner. So that you ask them, what is the nature of primary sampling units, for instance, in your country? My research partner is saying this is not possible. It is possible. That has helped me a lot when we had to implement service across Africa in about 15 countries. We realized that some of the things that our research partners said were not possible, the experts believe it was possible. So you have to sometimes go beyond your partners to engage other experts. They can help you to get other experts so that you engage them to know what is possible and what is not possible. But the meetings are very, very important. They have been helpful to us. We've met Jessica and Gemma several times to discuss some of these issues, and they have been really, really useful to us. They listen to us, we also listen to them, then we found a common ground, and that is to me very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the issue of comparability of different contexts, I think for probability samples, it's great to have the same systematic approach implemented in all the countries, right? And so it ensures the largest comparability. But it's a particular issue for convenience samples, because let's say you have 3 different contexts, and in each context you have a convenience sample. You don't know what the biases are in each of these settings. So when you compare them then, it makes it very difficult to compare them, because in one you could maybe accidentally oversampled women, in the next you oversampled young people, and in the third you oversampled people with lower educational backgrounds, and then you compare. That's why, that's where the advantages of probability samples come into play, because if it's done right, it's easier to compare across contexts, because you are referring to a base population that is similar across contexts. But there's a whole nother host of issues that sort of created a whole field of research, which is how surveys work in different cultural settings, right? So there's a whole issue of language, especially with migrants. You not only have to, the different migrant populations, have the survey translated to different languages that migrants speak. Questions can also have, in the same wording translated into different languages, have different meanings. So you have to work with, cultural translators, with, local knowledge, as Catia says, to not sort of get the right wording, but also get the right meaning of the question. And there are also other cultural aspects that are relevant for survey response. Some questions are considered more sensitive in certain cultures, so people are less likely to respond to them, or things like that. So I don't want to add an additional layer of headache here, but it just came to my mind because for comparability, that's a huge issue. And we're doing work in West Africa right now. You have lots of languages within the country among the majority population, right? Already a lot of local languages, but then you have additional languages from migrants, so it doesn't make things easier.
Thanks. Those were really good points. I should emphasize that with MIGNEX, of course, as you know, we're just starting data collection, so a lot of things remain to be seen how well they work. But one best practice that we're proud of pursuing so far is to make everything public of all our protocols. So the MIGNEX handbook that Jasper and Joseph have referred to, we create chapter by chapter as the project progresses. So chapter 7 with all the details of our sampling strategy is on the website. I can't remember now, Jessica, how many pages it is, 150 pages or something like that. All the nitty-gritty stuff. And it's been really helpful for us in the process to work with it as a document that we know will become public, and which we can review and circulate internally and get everyone's comments on, like Joseph mentioned, and which also in a way has to be able to stand up to scrutiny, and which can lower the threshold for others doing surveys and avoid or helping others avoid making the same mistakes or trying to figure out the same challenges. We're also trying to continuously reflect upon our experiences with the survey. So we've already posted a few posts on the MIGNEX website based on what we've experienced in terms of methodology, and we'll keep doing that again as the project progresses. So please sign up to the MIGNEX newsletter if you haven't already. And we are now running out of time. It's been great to hear everyone's thoughts, to get all the questions from the audience, many that we couldn't address, but I think we covered some really important and valuable points. I would also like to thank Rob and David and Mira and Nicole, who have been running the show behind the scenes and making sure everything ran smoothly. Thanks to the 4 presenters, and thanks to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. And for those of you doing surveys, good luck with your sampling. Bye.